Yeah. So in fact, I mean, I know that this is not the Perry workshop yet, but I'll start with some thanks before. I mean, I'm very happy that John Perry is here. I spent one wonderful year in Stanford, 1991, and that influenced me in many ways. Many people there, Dresky, Bratman, Echemendy, with whom I was working, but also, as you will see, John Perry. So I'm happy. Maybe he's not as happy seeing the consequences, but okay. I'm going to talk about the C thoughts, and I'm going to skip the initial introduction of the topic, but because you are all familiar with that, and it has been, in any case, introduced in previous talks. In particular, this idea that if you use a possible world framework to model contents, then you need something more fine-grained for modeling these contents. The contents ascribed by sentences like John remembers making a mess with this big pro. People use center walls for that purpose. Now, I think possible walls are very useful and interesting, and we need them. It's not that they are just instrumentally useful. There are operators that we use that operate on them, so we need them in our semantic theory. But I also think that they should be determined by more fine-grained things, like, for instance, structure propositions. And so I'm interested in the consequences that people have derived from the fact that you need these center walls to model the C thoughts. In particular, as you know, David Lewis argued on the basis of the fact that in this possible walls framework, you need these finer-grained things that are that would correspond to properties. Or he could argue that if you go to this more fine-grained perspective, then you should think that the contents of thoughts in general are properties and not traditional propositions that get a truth value given a wall. Now, that engendered a debate that continues today. Initially, Bob Stolniker objected to that view, and his grounds were that if you go with Lewis, then you cannot capture an informational content that is essential to explain communication. So, for instance, I'm not going to repeat the messy shopper story that you are familiar with, but so in the original story, the main character in that story, someone called John, comes to his epiphany on his own means, but he could have been told by a Samaritan shopper nearby, "You are making a mess," and in that way he would have acquired the information that leads to his epiphany through this act of communication. But of course, it's not the communication of the singular proposition about Perry to the effect that he's making a mess that is communicated, because that proposition he already knew before by having acquaintance with the guy that he was looking at, whose back he was looking at in the mirror. So he already knew the proposition of Perry that he was making a mess. So the epiphany must come from the fact that he gets somehow the C thought from the information that the Samaritan shopper provides. We should account for that. And in Lewis' framework, we cannot get the easy account that we would like to have of that, the easy account being one in which you get information, you get information about a given, you obtain a content by somebody else representing that content in language. Yeah, you wouldn't, because the Lewisian proposition that the Samaritan shopper self-ascribes leads him to utter, "You are making a mess," is something like being confronted with someone who is making a mess, while the Lewisian proposition that the character acquires is being making a mess, and there are different propositions, so you cannot explain how one is acquired on the basis of the other, at least on one easy model in which communication is just putting a proposition in words and the other guy acquiring the proposition. So on this basis, Stolniker said, we need something like traditional propositions to explain communication of these Dese contents instead of these Lewisian properties. And he provides these diagonal propositions on a given interpretation that we have been talk about. Given that I'm more interested in this more fine-grained structured propositions picture, then I suggest to think of them as token reflexive proposition. So the proposition in question, in the case of this example, would be the addressee of this use of you is making a mess. That would be the proposition that is expressed by the Samaritan shopper and captured by the character in the story. Now, as John had already made clear, but in any case, he made even more clear in a paper discussing Stolniker's views, this picture by itself does not solve the problem, because it's very easy to think of cases in which this very same diagonal proposition is learned, but it doesn't have the effects on action, rationality that Dese thoughts are supposed to have. So I could, for instance, this character, John, may overhear the Samaritan shopper saying, "You are making a mess," and may acquire the information that the addressee of that token is making a mess, but maybe he doesn't realize that he is the addressee for whatever reason. And then he continues his look for the... Okay, so there is this contrast between these suggestions, these ideas about how to account for the Dese. You have the property picture that Luis put forward. Then you have this attempt by Stolniker to defend that more traditional proposition account, that on this interpretation, which is okay to think that is the proper interpretation doesn't work. Now, Perry himself has been, throughout all these years, he has been suggesting a different picture. Well, in fact, in many details that we have been already exposed in this conference, it's not that different. But when you look at it from outside, independently of his views on unarticulated constituency in thoughts and these things, it looks different. It looks as if Perry is trying to manage with traditional propositions, and the idea is that you get to account for the Dese thoughts by having this distinction between the content of an state, of a mental state, or for a linguistic act, and the nature of the state itself. Something that in a postscript, his famous paper, he says, he accepts from Stolniker's picture is that you can use these token reflexive diagonal propositions to model the cognitive significance of the state. But he wants to insist, on the basis of the argument that I have just rehearsed, that you shouldn't interpret this as saying that the token reflexive content is just the content of a Dese thought, because that doesn't work. It's just that the picture has to be that to account for Dese thoughts, you need the content and the state, but given that the state is doing the job that contents traditionally do, accounting for rationality or explaining the rationality of actions, it must have some cognitive significance, and perhaps diagonal propositions or token reflexive propositions capture that. But you need to distinguish content from state. You need these two factors to account for mental states. By the way, in recent work, Stolniker has come to accept that you need to properly account for the state thoughts. You need something using only traditional propositions and not properties. You need something like these two factors picture, and now he has a different way of formalizing that very nicely and elegantly with center walls and distinguishing between the base and the relations with which the base is based, but that is not important for. Now, I like this picture more than the Lewisian one, although I will say something at the end about the comparison between the pictures. But I think that it raises issues that should be tackled. Some of them are common to all two-factor accounts of the mind that were many other people have provided two-dimensional, like Marc Richard or many other people. And the main issue that it raises is how is it that these states themselves have cognitive significance, how that interact with the cognitive significance that is already provided by their contents. Now, at these junctures, John usually talks about different taxonomical practices that we have for different purposes. And I particularly don't like that very much because it sounds very instrumentalistic. One would say that if they are natural kinds, we have all the right to think that the state thoughts are such a thing. It's not, they have a nature that makes them to have the properties that it's not just that we have these, well, of course, then we have these taxonomical practices, but they are grounded on real constitutive differences in the things themselves. So I think this provides a motivation for trying to understand better how is it that the states have cognitive significance and how that interacts with the cognitive significance already provided by their contents. Now, I myself have been arguing, you also know that there are now all these skeptics about the set that would deny that there is any natural kind here, like Herman or Ofra Magidor. And a point that they make is that, in fact, these famous Messi-Chopper cases showing the need of these Dese thoughts are just Frege cases. Well, in fact, this was not unknown to people introducing this topic. In the David Lewis' article on this it's an article on how to handle Frege cases in general, and John's proposal to distinguish state from content as other two-factor theories are just general frameworks to account for Frege cases. So this by itself does not raise any issue of skepticism, although William Lycan, for instance, already used for skeptical purposes this point in the 80s. Anyway, a proper account should be general, should include these thoughts in a general account of Frege cases. And I have been appealing to this distinction between presupposition and content to try to do that. I mean, to explain how is it that the states have cognitive significance and how that interacts with that provided by their contents. Some people, when it comes to the linguistic expressions that express them, some people have implemented this kind of account in dynamic semantic theories. accounts that are very close to the views I have are given by Emma Meyer and Julie Hunter. And in fact, Emma has a recent paper in which he applies that two thoughts along the very same lines that I'm going to suggest here. So what I will try to sketch in the time that I have is a way of applying this framework to show how we should handle this the thoughts. This will raise the issue of justification, the motivation for moving from the property to the proposition-like account of the said thoughts given by Stonlecker was based on this issue of the communication of the said thoughts, and as it will be clear, by adopting this way of having a traditional proposition framework, you don't solve that problem. You have exactly the same problem as Luis had. So this raises the issue of what the motivation could be for preferring this kind of account to the Luisian one. Okay, so I'll move now to sketch this account. So I follow John in thinking that the said thoughts do not differ in content from traditional fully propositional thoughts, but they differ as states. And I mention two cases that provide interesting analogies. I think the second one, in fact, is not just an analogy, it will be in the proposal that I will make a case exactly that should be treated exactly along the same lines. But I'm trying to start motivating this idea that how is it that we could account for the rationality of some actions or some inference by appealing to the state, the mental state, as opposed to its content. So there is first the distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual contents. So people want to say that perceptual experiences have contents, but they differ from the contents of beliefs or thoughts in that they are non-conceptual. And they speak of non-conceptual contents. But if you think about that, if you think of contents in possible worlds terms or even in structural propositions terms, that couldn't be right, because a perceptual state and a belief could have exactly the same sort of content. So many people have suggested that, like Richard Heck or myself, that the difference in question is not a difference in content, but a difference in the sort of state that has that content, and in particular in the sort of vehicle in which that state happens. A map-like vehicle versus a more linguistic-like vehicle. But that has cognitive significance, because whether you think on a map-like vehicle or in a linguistic vehicle affects the kind of inferences that you are prepared to make, whether you can use double negation, this kind of thing, and that has cognitive significance. The second case that is actually even closer, because it could be a case of the same, exactly the same kind of thing, is the difference between Hesperus and Hesperus, and on the one hand, Hesperus and Phosphorus on the other, or an utterance of Hesperus is small, followed by another of Hesperus is a planet, as opposed to followed by another of Phosphorus is a planet. It seems that there are inferences that you are prepared to make in one case that you are not prepared to make in the other case. And many people have argued that these are not facts that have to do with the content. The content could be exactly the same in all these cases. The contribution of Hesperus to content and Phosphorus could be exactly the same. The difference lies in these relations of de jure coreference, that when you use two tokens of Hesperus in this context, it's intended that they co-refer, while that doesn't apply to the other case. And again, these are differences that have to do, for many people, with the state in question and not with the content, that could be exactly the same. But also have cognitive significance in that these kind of relationships ground different inferential dispositions. So these are kind of suggestions for how could it be that states themselves could have cognitive significance over and above those furnished by their contents. And in fact, as you will see in the proposal that I am going to make, in the second kind of example fits entirely what the way I will reconstruct the state-content distinction in the case of the C thoughts. So very briefly, something about the distinction between the notion of presuppositions and how I propose to use them to model this state-content distinction. The idea is that in a structurally similar way, this will be more obvious perhaps later, but in a structural similar way to the case of Hesperus and Hesperus versus Hesperus equals Phosphorus. Utterances square marks because they could be mental, could be just judgments of he is making a mess and I am making a mess, do not differ in contents. Could be that he and I contribute the same entity to content, the same individual. The suggestion is that they differ in cognitively significant features that are extrinsic to them, extrinsic in the sense that the very same content could be presented with one or with the other. And in my proposal, there would be, these differences have to do with the conditions that the use of these vehicles, representational vehicles, impose on what is taken for granted, together with the state in which the relevant contents are represented. The contents could be the same, but the vehicles by means of which they are represented impose different conditions on what is assumed or what is taken for granted in the context in which these utterances occur. These things that are taken for granted, I reference fixing presuppositions relative to which these contents are determined. The suggestion would be that this distinction between asserted and presupposed content extends to at least to occurrent thoughts like judgments or decisions. And I like to think that on this basis it could be even extended in some cases to states like beliefs or but we can talk about that. So, simplifying a lot, the first utterance should occur in a setting in which an individual about whom it is identified by, we're going to use this, if you want to think of these mental vehicles along the way that recent tradition has suggested. If you want to think of these vehicles as mental dossiers or mental files, so the difference between the two judgments would be in the one is supposed to occur in a setting in which the object is identified by means of a mental file which is labeled as the salient male. A difference between this suggestion about files and other suggestions is that files, although the information that is inside the file, as it were, is irrelevant to determine what it is about, files come with labels, and these labels are, well, in fact, they will be these presuppositions that I am suggesting, and these labels do the reference fixing. It cannot be the case that the file has a referent at the referent, and the referent does not satisfy the reference fixing label. While, of course, the difference with the second is that in the second, the file in question has the label the owner or the subject or whatever. the labels are what I suggest we take Fregean modes of presentation to be there. So they are aspects of the state in which, in the sense that they are these associated beliefs that come with the state with a given content. Associated presumptions or presuppositions. So I say now something about the distinction between about presuppositions and meaning in general. Just short reminders. So if you consider sentences like John stole the camera and it was John who stole the camera, it could be that the state of information that you end up with when you accept one or the other is exactly the same relative to the way you start. But they differ in meaning. I want to say, I mean, I'm assuming a framework in which presuppositions are not just pragmatic. They could be semantic in the sense that they are lexically triggered and they should be handled by a proper semantic account, like a dynamic semantic or something like that. So the difference lies in that the cleft sentence, it was John who stole the camera, presupposes that someone stole the camera, but not the former. And not going into the details of different views about presuppositions, we can assume for present purposes this Stolnekerian account in which presuppositions are will have these features. Speech acts take place relative to a common ground, which is a set of already accepted propositions, and linguistic presuppositions are requirement on this common ground. Such that if they are not met, if the common ground doesn't include them, then the sentence is inappropriate. Of course, there are ways of releasing this inappropriateness by accommodating the presupposition. I'm not going to enter into that. So the cleft sentence, it was John who stole the camera, would feel inappropriate in a context in which it's not already assumed, taken for granted, common knowledge that someone stole the camera. This is the difference with John stole the camera that would be perfectly appropriate in a context in which such a thing is not taken for granted. So the suggestion is that similarly, utterances of he is hungry and I'm hungry make two different separable representational contributions. There is the asserted content, which I take to be, in this structured propositions framework, a singular proposition. X is hungry for some contextual assignment to the variable. While they impose requirements on, so the act of uttering them imposes requirements on the common ground, and this is as a matter of the lexical meaning of the relevant expressions, is something that the semantics should take into consideration, also because it has compositional implications, etc. It's a constitutive aspect of the expressions that they impose this, that the act of uttering them imposes these requirements on the common ground. In these particular cases, it could be some adequate elaborations of, I'm not going to go into the details, but something like for he is hungry, could be something like that token of he refers to the demonstrated male. For I, that token of I refers to the speaker. Could be this metalinguistic contents. I'm also taking for granted that it could be that there is no assignment to X, so this should be stated in a free logic, but we don't need to care about that. Now, I'm going to illustrate this by dealing with briefly with the second cases of the two that I introduced to motivate my way of elaborating on the state-content distinction and on how we could think of states so that states have cognitive significances their own over and above those of their contents, those given by their contents. So I'm going to say briefly something about how we should handle the jure coreference. So for that purpose, I'm going to use this notion of a semantic requirement that Kitfind has used for a similar purpose. But although, as you will see, I like the notion of a semantic requirement, and I think we should borrow that for these purposes. I don't like the account that he provides, but I will not go into these details in the presentation. So what are semantic requirements? These are just truths that state semantic facts. Semantic facts are facts involving semantic notions like designation, synonymy, reference. And these facts constitute a semantic theory, which is a body of information closed under manifest consequence. Manifest consequence is just consequence manifest or obvious to an ideal cognizer. And these facts are facts that a rational, reflective subject who fully understands the language is in a position to know, that captures not perhaps what understanding the language is, but at least what is a consequence of what understanding is. Fine suggests, and I think that he is right, that in the same sense that we can talk about semantic requirements in the case of a semantic theory, there is something like that when we move to a psychosemantic, to a theory of the representational contents of a mind. Then we can talk about representational requirements instead of semantic requirements. But there are such requirements. Now, this phenomenon that I mentioned before, the jure coreference, the relation between Hesperus and Hesperus in Hesperus equals Hesperus, that doesn't obtain between Hesperus and Phosphorus in Hesperus equals Phosphorus. Fine proposes to analyze just by saying that it's a semantic requirement that the two terms co-refer. It's one of these semantic facts that capture understanding or are consequences of understanding. So the difference between Hesperus equals Hesperus and Hesperus equals Phosphorus is that it's a semantic requirement that the two terms co-refer in the first case, but it's not a semantic requirement that the two terms co-refer in the second case. This is his account. I don't like his account for several reasons. It's essentially relationist, and that creates complications that I don't think are required. Also, it could be that in cases in which we think that this relation of de jure coreference obtains, in fact, we are mistaken. This is something that John also has written convincingly about. It could be that we take two terms to be in this relation of de jure coreference, but in fact they refer to different things. So we could be mistaken about that. So it cannot be a semantic fact that the two terms co-refer. We only here Fine speaks of putative semantic requirements, something that we believe obtains, but in fact does not obtain. That would be a consequence of my account. Anyway, I think that we can deal with these cases without positing these primitive relations between terms. How? Well, by going presuppositional, by saying that what is a semantic requirement is not that the two expressions co-refer, but that the two expressions are taken to co-refer or are presupposed to co-refer. And this applies. This is just a particular case of a general fact about indexicals. So in the case of a non-anaphoric use of he, I think that there is a semantic requirement that the use presupposes that it refers to the demonstrated male. And similarly, in the case of an anaphoric use of the same expression, he anaphoric with respect to a previous expression, so in fact there are essentially similar, is only that the presupposition in the case of a deictic use has to do with something demonstrated, and in the case of an anaphoric use is that the expression co-refers with something else with which it was in a relation of anaphoric dependence. So this would be a proposal on which, as suggested in the motivating introduction, the relations of anaphoric dependence are explained as aspects of the act in which they are made, and not aspects of the contents that these uttering acts have. But still, they are semantic because although they are aspects of the state, the aspect in question is just another act. The idea is that these representational acts, the act of representing someone as hungry, comes with an associated ancillary act of presupposing something about how the entity that we are talking about is fixed. Okay, so the suggestion is that this, as I indicated, that I outlined at the beginning, could be applied to the mental case too. Of course, we should make distinctions. It's not the same thing to presuppose in the linguistic case as in the mental case. In the linguistic case, it's something communicative, it's something having to do with requirements on what is common knowledge. And this should be explained and defined adequately, because in many cases it cannot be said that it's a matter of knowledge, but anyway. But it's something that has to do with the speech situation, while in the mental case it cannot be something like that. It has to be something about the other beliefs that should be assumed to be part of your general state when you are judging something or making a decision. But there are sufficient analogies, I would say, to explore this possibility. And it will have the nice feature that at least allows us to understand how is it that the interesting aspects of the essay have to do with something that looks like a content, but is not the content of the state in question. How is it? Well, because it has to do with something like a presupposition that is part of the representational state. That was the outline of the suggestion. As I said, it's intended as an elaboration of what John has been saying. In fact, in the paper I have isolated several articles and several paragraphs in different pieces of his work in which he comes very close to say something very similar, to suggest that these aspects of the state have to do with something that is presupposed, but I don't know what. The final question would be, okay, now we have these two pictures. We have the Lewisian property, self-ascribed property picture. We have this alternative way of accounting for the essay using just traditional propositions. Traditional proposition that is the content of the state, and another traditional proposition that captures the cognitive significance, the additional cognitive significance of the state, because it's just something that is an ancillary mental act, which is an ancillary belief that plays the role of an assumption or something like that. Assuming that there are no counterexamples and obvious ways of showing that this cannot work, is there a reason to prefer one to the other? Now, Francois has been arguing for property-like Lewisian picture, picture like, and the way I understood Simon, he was trying to defend for some basic cases of thoughts, which is in fact a picture that, as we have seen in John's reaction to Simon's paper and other, is the view that John himself has for confusingly, but he has this Lewis-like, property-like picture for, at least for basic thoughts. And Francois has argued for that on the basis of a phenomenon which is related, but complicatedly, to the issue of Dessay thoughts, which is this phenomenon of the immunity to error through misidentification of some Dessay thoughts. He says that the Lewisian picture gives us a better way of handling these cases, this feature, and we should prefer it because of this. Basically, the idea is that in the Lewisian picture, the subject is not a constituent of the content, and then you don't need to worry about identifying it. And then, although I haven't said what this immunity is, but the idea is that then there will be an immunity. You cannot be mistaken about its identity because it's not represented in the content. It comes with the act or something like that. Well, I cannot go into the details, but I don't think this work, and I have argued in independent work that this is not a reason to prefer the Lewisian picture to that. Accepting that Dessay thoughts always include the subject as represented as a part of the content, which I think is something that you independently need for reasons having to do with inferences like those I have been pushing against Gregory or Simon. Anyway, you could account for immunity to error through misidentification in this big framework that I have outlined, as nicely at least as in the property picture. Now, there is the issue of communication. Could it be that we can argue for the Perrian traditional proposition account on the basis of the issue of communication? Well, obviously, now that I have presented the picture, it should be obvious that you cannot, because the important work for the Dessay is done by the cognitive significance of the state, not the content, and the state that leads the Samaritan shopper to utter, "You are making a mess," is totally different from the state that the character in the messy shopper situation gets to form when he accepts that and thereby stops and looks for the torn sack. So communication is not going to give an advantage to the Perrian picture. In fact, I think that, well, the same maneuvers that Lewisians have provided to explain communication in a more complicated way could be easily adapted to explain communication in this framework that I have outlined, but in equally complicated ways. Okay. So, on the other hand, I haven't gone into that, but it should be also relatively easy to see that the proposal I have made entails a form of what John called limited accessibility view of the Dessay, a view like Frege, which because these aspects of the state that are essential to account for the peculiarities of the Dessay have to do with presuppositions that only the subject that has the relevant thoughts can make properly. Is this a disadvantage? Well, I don't think it is, because if you reflect on the self-ascribing part of the property view and the details, you will see that you have there similar problems. So is there a reason to choose one to the other? The matter should be handled, I think, globally. It should be a matter of how the two frameworks deal with the general issues. In fact, it's, as I said, these problems of that essay are just Fregean problems in general, so the question should be a global evaluation of the two frameworks. If you compare the one I have, the two-factor kind of picture that I have outlined, I think you should prefer that to Lewis himself view, which is a one-factor view, but needs to go fully descriptivist to be a one-factor view. Need to adopt very heavily descriptivist assumptions. But on the other hand, there are ways to go two-factor in the Lewisian picture. So, and Francois, for instance, has been suggesting these ways of taking the picture. So maybe in the end, there are no real reasons to decide between these two pictures. I every day tend to think more that this is the case in this particular debate. I myself am more happy thinking in a traditional proposition framework, and I think this suggests a way for handling that which fits my aesthetics attitudes. But perhaps this is all that there is to it, and in the end, they are just two different but equally acceptable ways of representing these matters. Thank you.
Thanks. I need to. That would be great. Thanks. Okay, well, thanks for a very interesting and rich paper that I am not going to engage with most of it because a lot of this has to do with how to engage with issues having to do with opacity and how to choose between two different frameworks. Just to sketch my own view of this, I think opacity is an illusion. I don't think there is really any substitution puzzle. So it's hard for me to engage in internal debates about that. So I'm going to pick up a few. I think those aren't really the central points that you're going to talk about, but it relates to these themes that we've seen throughout this workshop about issues having to do with this terminology and ideology that was introduced by Perry and Lewis about the day safe, essential indexicality, and the first-person perspective. And I think that in some ways these are making it harder to see what people are trying to do in the, like what Manuel is trying to do in this paper. I think is not helpful. So I'm going to do a kind of, let's just get rid of all that stuff that you're talking about in that connection. And there's still an interesting project there, and you didn't need to talk about all that stuff. That's going to be the plan. So, to get to that, I'll just say a little bit about the topic as I think about it. It's kind of difference between a restricted and an ambitious project involving the day say and the first person perspective. Say a little bit about opacity and distinctiveness, and then talk a bit about Manolo's view in relation to those bigger points. So in connection with the issues that and the literature that have sprung out of John's and Lewis' work over the last 30, 40, whatever years, very long time, thousands of papers and books. Yeah, I think there's a way to distinguish two strands. There's a kind of restricted strand. I think John was saying the title should have been "Why Indexicals Are Sometimes Useful for Talking About Some Mental States." That's like, great. If that had been the title, I've been like, but I think there wouldn't really have been 5,000 papers, as John correctly pointed out. And I think that is because people thought there was much more to it. Now, the restricted project is a kind of lexicography or sort of a restricted semantic problem. Well, there's certain terms, they're context sensitive, we can get a rough intuitive sense of what that is. And how do we incorporate those into a semantics and a syntax and a pragmatics? There's one thing that, and I'm going to come back to this a bit later, one very obvious thing, they have this totally obvious feature, they shift reference from context to context. So that is a starting point, a data point for everyone. That's not a point of theory, I take it. That is a distinctiveness. That's very distinctive about them. And so now, if you're doing the more restricted project, you might be interested, well, is there something more than that becomes important about them when we try to do semantics? Well, there's a lot of things you could say. There's like the sort of things, can we do context shifts and the sort of things that Schlenker have talked about and that become a big literature? Those are interesting issues. How do we do the meta-semantics for them? Those are interesting questions. So there's a cluster of questions about distinctiveness with respect to how we treat these in a semantic theory. There's one point that's, and Manuel's in agreeing with me here, I think, though some of what was going on later made me worried. One of the points that Josh and I make in that book called The Inessential Lexical is that in the literature since Perry and Lewis, and maybe Perry and Lewis were crystal clear on this, that is very possible, there is just massive confusion on the question of whether confusing their opacity with something distinctive. I mean, when you say it like that, it just sounds ridiculous. But I am happy to document a very, very large literature where that confusion goes through. So even though maybe this had been mentioned a few times, and I'm sure every truth had been mentioned occasionally, it would have been really helpful if that had been really highlighted along the way. Now I think that if we're looking at indexicals because we are, there's just an instance of if the trolley case was just like the Frege cases, why did we even need them? They just add this other little complexity of shiftable characters. No, I've been 3 minutes and 46 seconds, it says here. Yeah, I have my own counter. Okay. So I think that if all you want to do is an account of how you the conditions under which you can and cannot substitute co-referential terms, I think it's just noise to look at indexicals. If really that's all you want to do, I don't know why we're think about these cases, because they do introduce noise, because they're distinctive in various ways. Just want a general theory, why focus on those? Take the general case, Frege cases, develop a theory for that. Now, of course, what we know is that some of those people who like the views that German mathematician Gottlob Frege developed really, really long time ago. They're really devoted to develop versions of his. They run into some troubles because they have a set of theses that gives them problems with it. But I think that the general strategy, if all you just wanted to start with as a theorist was how do I deal with opacity, you wouldn't focus on these cases. Ambitious project, not Perry's, we've been told over and over again during this workshop. And these are the kinds of things that people say. And I'm just going to sketch them really quickly. So some people think there's this very important essential, I don't know what the word essential means, but this is the kind of terminology that's been introduced, essential connection between indexicals and agency. You might think there's some essential connection between indexicals and information gathering. There's some essential connection between certain kinds of immunity to error through misidentification and indexicals. Or you might think that perceptual contents, the way the world is presented to us in perception, is somehow essentially indexical. Those are all not of the restricted kind that I talked about. They're exciting projects. That's why this is a fun topic to work on. If it was true, it would be great. And you could say all these fancy things about how egocentric this and that connected us to these other important topics. So I'm going to get to Manuel's paper very soon and talk about what the philosophical upshot is of the proposal that he has, if it is right. I just want to say a bit more. So I think these claims about ambition and these larger projects, But when Josh and I give talks about this, very often people say, no one ever meant that. That was all just like, that really isn't true. These ambitious projects are permeating philosophy. It's far beyond people who talk about philosophy. So if we philosophers of language have been responsible for contaminating these other parts of philosophy, we should really do some cleanup work. So here's just one example. It's David Velleman's most recent book. Actually, all of David Velleman's work, and he's an arbitrary chosen example. Go to Bas van Fraassen, go to tons of other philosophers. They took all this stuff to have really deep, significant implications for the nature of, for example, human agency or information gathering. I'm not going to read these quotes out, but you could see. So the point so far is just that the philosophical tradition outside of maybe a few clear-headed philosophers of language, like Perry, have taken these claims to have much more significance. Okay, what does Manuel think the significance is? So this is not exactly from the slides, but from the paper that I got. So why should we care about this philosophically? He says, he asks at some point in the paper, and he says, the proposal shows why they say thoughts are philosophically important. If the proposal is correct, that is his proposal, we should abandon one of the traditional tenets about intentional contents, namely their shareability. For although anybody can have a thought about the owner of a given mental state of mind, only I can have a thought about myself by correctly presupposing that my thought is about the owner of the very thought of which this presupposition is an auxiliary constituent. This is a form of Perry's limited accessibility thesis doctrine, even if mild by his slides. And he says, even if the proposal is wrong, the fact that a forceful contender to account for a ubiquitous type of thought has this feature suffices to make it philosophically significant. It points to a clear sense in which thought is necessarily from a particular perspective. Okay, so that does sound kind of interesting. So now there's a slight deflation of this. I don't think we need Perry or Lewis or the presuppositional account to figure this out. I think it is a corollary of the variable character of indexicals and that very simple distinctiveness point that I made at the beginning. Let E be an expression with a variable character. Let E in the context C express P. With just a few additional assumptions, you can see that only in C can one use E to express P. So for here, only in location L can you use here to refer to L. Yesterday, only today, can we use yesterday to refer to Tuesday the 3rd. Is that right? Yeah, maybe. We are in this room and enjoying discussions about essential indexicality. Only with this group can you use we in that way. And of course, it's also true about I. So I didn't think we needed really to read any of the literature, actually read any literature or philosophers or linguists or anyone to figure that out. So if that was the philosophically significant thing, then I failed to be overwhelmed by it. So I think what's interesting is whether the presupposed states are doing important additional philosophical work. And that's the point at which, when you go back to the opacity point, as you say, it's just generally about opacity. There's nothing particularly, if there's nothing particularly distinctive about them, then there wasn't much philosophical mileage that came out of it. It's that if you claim that those particular presupposed states do some additional work, that would be helpful. I'll skip that. And so what we argue in the book is that there isn't anything interesting about these particular characters. So now I am out of time, 20 seconds, but I have 2 more slides that is more specific, and they're going to go really quick. Can I do that? Okay, so I feel like I haven't very much engaged in detail with Manolo's paper, so I'm going to say a bit. I'd like to hear a bit more if it is going to matter what the presupposed states are. So Manolo says the thing that's presupposed is that token of I refers to the speaker. But why choose that option? So Higginbottom, who had a similar view, did it, but he did it in order to capture this thing about immunity to error through misidentification. That was the explicit motivation throughout all of Higginbottom's work on it. But you don't share that. So that was the one where you refer to self-reflectively refer to the token. And if you don't have that motivation, there are some other options, and I'm just curious how we can choose between them. So think of the character as just a function from a context to a content. Maybe the function is common knowledge. We speak a language. We know that function for a particular indexical. And maybe what is added to the common ground as a presupposition is that we are in C, where C is what specifies what the value is going to be for that indexical given that function. That might matter philosophically if the nature of the state matters at the end of the day. So I'd like to hear just a bit more about how we choose the presupposed content. But thanks. Should I take this away? It doesn't matter. It's going to run out of battery, so I'm going to take it away.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm in favor of the ambitious project. In the end, it doesn't. This was very short thing, limited to elaborating a bit on this Perrian view and how to handle this distinction between state and contents. But I do. I mean, I'm not as ambitious as Simon seemed to me to be. I mean, I don't want to have an a priori argument that any rational agent should have this kind of thoughts. I don't know how to think about gods or angels, but I do think that human. So it's the difference between the opacity of Hesperus and Phosphorus and the opacity in these cases is that these cases occur in. So you could have subjects that don't have either the Hesperus or the Phosphorus concept, but all human subjects that I know of have this kind of thoughts. We need them to explain the action of ordinary human beings, while there are many for which the Hesperus-Phosphorus case that doesn't show up. But so although it's not essential in the sense that I'm going to make a claim that is absolutely necessary, that is unthinkable, that there are subjects that I don't know. I don't even know how to think about this. I do think that there are these traditional Messi shopper examples. They do show that by appealing to very easy million, these million rules for determining causation of commonalities and differences, just by appealing to this kind of thoughts, we can establish that to properly explain the actions that we engage in and the rational inferences in which you are going to need this kind of thoughts always. So it's ambitious. I'm also interested, I think that there is this phenomenon of immunity to error through misidentification. I do think that there are absolute or logical cases of that, and this, my suggestion, in fact, can be used to provide a good account of that. I do that in a different paper. Very similar to Higginbotham, but better than him because he's exposed to the problem that John pointed out for Stolniker's view, because he just takes these token reflexive contents to be just the content of the relevant states. That doesn't work for the reason that John pointed out, but my bet is that, or my hope is that if you have this two-factor theory, you can handle that, and you can handle famous cases that have been used by Francois, among others, against Higginbotham. Anyway, so it's the answer in simple terms is that I'm in for a form of the ambition project, not as ambitious as trying to show that the state thoughts are necessary for any human being. That I cannot, I don't know how to do, but ordinary beings, you need them. They are always there, and if they have these consequences, that is interesting, I would say, and it's related to many philosophical concerns about Cartesian concerns about, Anyway. But yeah, that's all. Thank you.
So I agree with a lot of what you said. I have a question about the presuppositions in the mental case. Where do they come from? In the linguistic case, you might say that there are certain conditions and use of certain expressions. So where do the presuppositions come from in the mental case? And this is related to another issue. You talked about mental files, and you said that you favor the sort of a, I suppose it's Picard's way of looking at them with a sort of label, where the label is not like the information in the file that could well be false. The label has a different role and couldn't be false. And I wonder what that label is, because it's a sort of technical thing, but I wonder what it corresponds to. So on my own view, which is very similar to yours, because I also have presuppositions, I also have a two-factor account with vehicles, and the cognitive significance cashed out in terms of presupposition actually derive from the vehicle, this property of the vehicle. The way I see presupposition is just that those files have certain roles, certain function. They are used to do certain things, and basically there are relations which stand to things in the environment, and there are types of files that correspond to different types of relations. So when we deploy a certain file in thinking about an object, it's presupposed that we are standing in the relevant relation to the object. So what I appeal to is this notion of a function or role of a file in the mental economy. And I don't quite understand, in your case, what the presupposition corresponds to, again, in the mental case.
Ultimately, it will be very similar. It will be representational requirements. In fact, in your case, I mean, the way you describe it, now it sounds very descriptive. And in fact, I guess that you don't want it so descriptive, because at crucial occasions you appeal to somehow normative aspects. So. But I guess that if you elaborated that, it would be very similar. So it comes from the nature of the representational system, as it were, and it should be captured by these requirements on what is the nature of that system, and in particular, what is the nature of these files. These files are supposed to be of the thinker of the very thought in which they occur, for instance. For a more permanent thing, this file, from a more permanent self thing, that is supposed to be of the subject of which in normal conditions it gets proprioceptive information, it's at the center of the set of axes in the scenario content of that perceptual experience. It could be a normative side of something that ultimately has a functional structure. Yeah.
So thanks for the talk. I mean, I haven't read everything you've written, but I've read a fair amount, and this helped me understand some of it. I'm especially happy that you've read that paper I wrote in the Stolnicker volume, which I thought maybe only Bob and I had read, and noticed that he changed his views a little bit. And I think you put your finger on what's probably the difference between us is I'm not a Lewisian in terms of possible worlds and all that stuff. But an earlier project of his, the Armstrong-Lewis view about folk psychology and mental states always appealed to me. And I've come to think I understand it far better than he did, modestly. So I really don't think of contents as intrinsic features of mental states. I think of them as parts of this folk psychology, which has somehow, in the absence of even knowing that the brain was the organ concerned, come up with this brilliant classificatory system that we use to explain and predict and even express our own thoughts. So I think we have a deep disagreement there, but most deep disagreements turn out to be deep agreements, so maybe we can get into that. I just want to say something about what Herman said, because I think he's quite right that these are Frege cases, these essential indexical cases that I use, that is, cases in which if you take the indexical out, you seem to have lost something. It's essential in that sense, not that, you know, that the Big Bang came with indexicals. But the reason I think that if you go back to 1977, say, or 75, when I was working on this, and I suppose Herman was maybe in kindergarten, I don't know. Here's the way it looked. There was a framework in which the discussion about opacity and substitution was carried on. Everybody accepted there was a concept of de dicto belief. You might think that the dicto was a Fregean proposition. You might think it was a Fodorian sentence in a belief box. You might think that it was something from Quine or Davidson, but something like a de dicto belief, and the dicto in question would not be context relative. It would have a truth value just depending on what the world was like. And that wasn't even usually had to be stated. Then everybody agreed that quantifying in required something like a concept of de re belief. But was that a separate kind of belief, or just a way of speaking about de dicto beliefs that fit some further requirements? The classic exposition of that latter view is Cappelen's quantifying in. Right. So insofar as you accepted that there were cases where you could quantify in, and maybe cases where you could substitute, you might think that was just because of some additional requirements of being acquainted with the object, or vivid names, whatever. But it didn't in any way destroy the dictoness and context insensitiviness of the basic vehicles of belief. Then the stuff on proper names shook up the idea that de re belief could just be supervenient on de dicto belief. But still, that was the basic framework. So clearly, the indexical cases are Frege cases, but they're the last ones that came to people's attention, because the assumption had been, on everybody's part but Castaneda's, that indexicals were shortcuts. That what Frege had said about proper names may not have worked out for proper names, but surely it worked out for indexicals. I mean, Reichenbach had pointed out this was false, and so forth and so on, but still, within the philosophy of language community, that was accepted. And then David worked out this logic of indexicals that had the clear consequence that indexicals weren't going to supervene any more than proper names did. And so this was a new case, and it was very puzzling. I remember sitting with David in his, I guess it was actually in my living room in Ann Arbor at the time, and the thing was, there was some flexibility in the names case. No one was sure how names worked, but David had figured out exactly how indexicals worked. And it was just perfectly clear that you could have a belief which on his theory had a content that was a singular content without knowing the first thing about that object. You could sit there on Thursday and think it was Wednesday, but the content of your belief had Thursday in it. You could be an amnesiac and not know anything about yourself, as Castaneda had pointed out. So that was the reason that they seemed special, because they were the last ones. And the equipment that had been built up to deal with Frege's original problem, and then the fact that the descriptive theory didn't work out, and then the modal logic of it, that Hindeka had come up with, and the fact that his ideas didn't work out, which Castaneda pointed out, that was all there, and it didn't work. So that's, yeah, it was kind of obvious to everyone that these were Frege cases, and if we'd been thinking of the needs of people in 2014, we probably would have presented it in a different way. So that was the main point. Now, my own project is very ambitious, but it's ambitious. It's not that the word I gets in there because it's an ambitious philosophy of language project. It's I got into the philosophy of language because I wanted to understand the self. The word I goes back in its mysteriousness, at least, to Descartes and Hume, just to put Descartes before the Hume. And even that old fart Kant that was pictured up there, and I believe. So I don't think I needs the philosophy of language for its credibility as something for philosophers to think about. But I'll say a lot more about this in the next 2 days. And that's all.
Thank you. No.
I don't know if anybody else here is old enough to verify what I said about this. Maybe Francois, because he's so precocious. Maybe when he was in high school, he read quantifying, and I don't know.
Manuel, do you want to say anything? Or
No, I mean, I don't have anything. Very nice comments and very helpful to that.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Manuel. Yeah. I am. But I didn't read quantifying in when it came out, a couple of years later. So I got a little lost towards the end of the paper in the dialectic there. So I would like you to summarize. I take it that you thought you had solved the communication problem by means of this account, two-factor account with presuppositions. So if you could just summarize exactly how that works. Then I have, well, two minor things. One is whether presupposition is essential and whether it wouldn't do equally well with Cappelenian character as the other factor in the state. So what's special about presupposition? And also it's, I wonder how presupposition, since you do take it as semantic, it's outside content. So if it's a semantic presupposition, what is the interaction with content or semantic?
About the communication, I cannot put the slide anymore, but I didn't mean to have solved that. On the contrary, I said that this account has exactly the same problem of communication as the Lewisian one, and I think it can be solved, but basically it can be solved using strategies that can be equally used for in the Lewisian camp. Somehow, I mean, when this Samaritan shopper utters a content presupposing something, if you, the recipient, properly understand the situation, you can get at what he is presupposing and infer presupposition that will be your different presupposition. So, so this is not solving it. I mean, this is just dealing with it in a similar way to what the Lewisians can. So the last one was about.
So there were two others about
character.
Presupposition. why presupposition? Would character do equally well?
Character is just something related to a type of expression. It's not, so it's something that is always there. And I think that will not provide the adequate relation between what I take to be the ancillary state, the ancillary act.
Okay, so let me ask if I understand it correctly. I thought that the presupposition was that he, if used deictically, refers to the most salient male, but that's not what you're saying.
Yeah.
In a context, the presupposition that it refers to him, not to the most salient male, in general.
No. The presupposition is something that you obtain from character by plugging the particular token or use of expression to which that has that character. So the presupposition would be something like that. I mean, the relevant expression refers to the demonstrated male.
But under the description, the demonstrated male, or that individual who is the demonstrated male.
Under the description, the demonstrated male, yeah.
But then it's as general as the character.
The presupposition is that the relevant expression refers to that, and that has the concept that entails that the singular proposition that X is the demonstrated male too. But the presupposition itself is semantic in content; it has this referring relation. The token expression refers to.
Okay. And if well, a presupposition failure then is not necessarily a failure of reference.
Well, a presupposition failure could be a failure of reference, yes.
So if it doesn't refer to the most salient male, it doesn't refer at all.
Yeah.
That seems like an ordinary presupposition in the content.
Maybe I'm not following what the.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about
yeah,
later.
we can talk more about it.
Last, not too long question, Greg.
Thank you. So you say that the choice between the accounts might be a matter of taste because they would be equivalent in their predictions. And I just wonder, so now you are giving to the descriptions the role of reference fixing. So they are playing a semantic role, and so it seems that the presuppositions must be represented explicitly before I can refer to myself. So I'm wondering whether in order to be able to refer to myself, do I have first to know a truth about myself? And if so, how do I come to know that truth about myself? Would you claim that it's the same thing to come to know that the owner of this state is the owner of this state, and to come to know that I am the owner of this state?
It doesn't follow. I don't take it to follow that they have to be represented in the way that you said. And there are requirements on how the system functions, but it could be that in the cases of, I don't know, babies or... So I would say that epistemically they're always required for the justification of the relevant, more ordinary beliefs that, but they don't need to be represented in a kind of inference. There are epistemic requirements on that, but it could be that only with sophistication and acquiring the relevant concepts, and so you are able to articulate them. I don't take this to be a reductive descriptivist view at all. I mean, it could be that in some basic representational systems, the only thing that is articulated is just the singular proposition. So I don't take the aim of this to be to get a descriptivist reduction of the. I take possibility of representing singular propositions to be as basic as it gets. Yeah, you have been, I mean, I have been discussing this paper with Gregory and other people that have been very helpful in thinking me about these matters, for instance, about this one by Gregory.
Okay, so we should thank Manolo again